Hello everyone, I'm Frodo and I am coming to you from Florida, US of A. I hope you are staying safe and sane, and you have my sincere thanks for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If it sounds like my speech is even more sloppy than usual, I apologize. No, I haven't been drinking, and as far as I know, I haven't suffered a stroke yet. But I have been dealing with some ongoing TMJ issues for years. I once had a new dentist cry out, "Oh my God," when she was assessing the clicking in my jaw. Not something you ever want to hear from a medical professional. But it's just something I've gotten used to, honestly. However, it decided to flare up with a vengeance this week, and when it gets too bad, my enunciation can get even worse than usual. But I've been applying some ice packs to my jaw, which seem to help, so I'm going to give recording this episode the old community college try. Before I get into today's main focus, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank Western Bulldogs AFLW star Danny Marshall for liking, commenting on, and even sharing episodes of this podcast. And I am just blown away by this. I had the privilege and pleasure of actually meeting Danny here in Florida last year at the USAFL Nationals, and she is so kind and humble that I really hope I don't embarrass her too much by talking about her here. If nothing else comes out of all of this, having an athlete of her stature telling me she likes my work makes it all worth it. Thank you so much, Danny. Some of you might be thinking, what is this USAFL he just mentioned? Well, if you didn't know, Australian rules football is actually played outside of Australia, all around the world in fact. Not professionally, not yet anyway, but here in America, the United States Australian Football League has been going strong and growing for almost 25 years and currently has nearly 50 teams across the nation. About half of these have both men's and women's teams. In fact, this is where Danny Marshall herself got her start in footy. I plan on going into much more detail about footy here in the USA on a future episode. But for now, if you want to learn more, I would highly recommend the Outside 50 podcast at www.usfootynews.com. My friend Tara Silke of the Denver Bulldogs just joined the crew with Rick and Ben, and they put out a great product. A link is provided in the show notes as well. Okay, now to the heart of the matter. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the man they call Mr. Football. Ted Whitten, or EJ as he was affectionately called, is a Bulldogs, and in fact an Aussie rules, legend in the highest and purest sense of the word. I am no historian or scholar, and I know many people revere his memory on and off the field. Some actually had the honor of knowing him in real life, but I shall endeavor to introduce him to people who are less familiar with his life and legacy. I'm sure there are many stories and anecdotes that I myself am unfamiliar with, and I mean no slight or insult by leaving them out. But I think someone who is identified as the game itself deserves to have his story told, even if by someone as uninitiated as myself. Edward James Whitten, or perhaps more famously known as E.J. Whitten or Ted Whitten, was born on July 27, 1933. The second of three children, he grew up in the West Melbourne suburbs of Braybrook and Footscray, and was a Footscray Bulldog supporter his whole life. Going to school at St. Augustine's in Yarraville, young Teddy loved to go over to the Western Oval with his brother to watch his beloved team train and play. His favorite player was Arthur Oliver. He later got a job as a factory hand at a cannery. One day in 1949, he was spotted having a kick-to-kick during his lunch break and was invited to play for the Braybrook Football Club in the Footscray District League. In 1950, while captaining the Braybrook Juniors to the finals, Whitten won the Best and Fairest award for not only his team, but for the entire league. But that was just on Saturdays. On Sundays, he began playing for the Collingwood Amateurs in a wild and extremely rough league and won Collingwood's Best and Fairest as well at the tender age of 16. He was, of course, invited to try out for Collingwood in the then VFL Premier League. He actually had family ties to Collingwood. However, once there, he was told that he needed to bulk up, and was encouraged to return in a year to try out again. This was the opening Footscray needed and invited him to go on a player's retreat at the end of the 1950 season to Tasmania. After returning home, Ted had decided that the Footscray Football Club was where he belonged. As fate would have it, he was soon assigned the number 3 Guernsey that had belonged to Arthur Oliver himself. During training in the 1951 preseason, going up against other future Bulldogs legends like Jack Collins, Herb Henderson, Peter Box, and player-coach Charlie Sutton, Whitten quickly learned what a huge step up league play was compared to what he had known. But he held his own, and, just as importantly, also learned from his teammates and coach, and as a 17-year-old, he was selected to play center half forward for the first round of the regular season. Whitten's first match in the VFL was on Saturday, April 21, 1951, at Punt Road Oval against the Richmond Tigers. He had been warned that he would most likely be targeted by one of the roughest and toughest footballers to ever play the game by the name of Don Mopsy Fraser. And sure enough, as Whitten ran out to his spot, Fraser came over to join him. Whitten reached out to shake hands, but instead Fraser kicked him in the leg and warned him not to try him. As the match began, Whitten ran towards the ball with Fraser closing in on him. Ted suddenly stopped, causing his opponent to crash into his back. Getting up and dusting himself off, Whitten was awarded a free kick. And less than a minute into his first VFL game, Whitten slotted his first ever official kick of a Premier League ball through for 6 points. Fraser was apparently not impressed, instead insinuating that young Teddy had just made a huge mistake by playing him for a fool. But Whitten proved too fast for Fraser to cover, and another defender was eventually assigned the role. Ted seemed to have settled in well in his first game. However, in the third quarter, as Ted was going backwards following the ball, Fraser saw his chance and ran right through him. Whitten was subsequently carried off the field, knocked unconscious. Still, a memorable debut for the young footballer, and a lesson well learned. In his career, he would go on to give as good as he got, maybe even then some. Even without Ted's services, the Doggies would go on to win that match by 1 point, 15-9-99 to 15-10-100. Footscray would go on to finish 4th on the ladder that year, back when only the top 4 teams moved on to the finals, but unfortunately ended up losing to Essendon in the semifinal. For his part, Ted had not been able to properly prepare himself for the finals match, as he had been called up for his military service, and his request for leave to play the final had initially been denied. It took the last-minute intervention of a footy fanatical Australian Prime Minister to let Corporal Whitten be granted leave to play. But the seeds of a future premiership side had been sown. 1952 was a disappointment, largely due to injuries, but Whitten and his teammates finished 3rd on the ladder in 1953, losing the preliminary final to Geelong. However, in 1954, the Footscray Bulldogs' hopes were high, and rightly so. They started slow, with one of their best scorers, Jack Collins, off getting married and honeymooning while serving out the rest of his suspensions from the previous season. But once he returned, the Sons of the Scray were nearly unbeatable. Though he could excel at virtually any position on the ground, for the 1954 season, Whitten spent much of his time at centre half-back. With fellow defenders such as Wally Donald and Herb Henderson, they were a virtual red, white, and blue wall, and they held most other teams to relatively negligible scores. They finished 2nd on the ladder, and this time dominantly charged past Geelong into the grand final against the Norm Smith-coached Melbourne Demons. So many fans crowded into the MCG for the 1954 Granny, nearly 81,000 of them, that some spilled over onto the field itself, sitting just outside the boundary line. Could this really be the day that Footscray finally took home the flag? The way they played the home and away season and powered through the finals made them the most likely premiership favorites of any team in years. But then Footscray fans had known finals heartbreak many times before. Turns out the Bulldogs faithful had nothing to worry about. Sutton had molded his individual stars into a cohesive and unstoppable machine. Though the Demons goaled first, and then 3 more in the second quarter, Footscray went into halftime with twice as many. In the locker room, Sutton warned his men that Melbourne would try to rally back in the second half. But once play resumed, the Doggies' defense clamped down and quickly helped move the ball forward to Jack Collins, who booted a total of 7 goals that day. By the end of the third term, the lead had increased to over a 6-goal difference. And when the final siren sounded, Footscray had won its first ever VFL Premiership flag by doubling up the Demons to the tune of 15-12-102 to 7-9-51. In season 1955, the Scray just missed the finals by a mere 0.6 percentage difference. The Bulldogs tied with Essendon at 12 games won, 6 losses each. And in 1956, the Bullies returned to the finals, despite Charlie Sutton announcing his retirement as a player, but continuing on as coach. Unfortunately, the Dogs missed out on a return to the big dance with a preliminary finals loss to Collingwood. The next year, on March 15th, 1957, Whitten became a father when Ted Jr. was born. One day to become a Footscray star himself, but it was not to be the only major change Whitten would experience this year. Before round 13th of the 1957 season, a young Ted Whitten, at just 23 years of age and with a mere 110 games under his belt, was shocked to be approached by the Footscray committee about taking over for Charlie Sutton as player-coach, who had been suddenly relieved of his duties. Such was their faith in the young footballer. He was told that if he did not accept the increased responsibility, an outsider would be appointed. Whitten reluctantly agreed. The youngest coach in the league, he was given the unenviable task of coaching his fellow players, some who were his senior by nearly a decade, and some of whom were loyal to Sutton and resisted the change in leadership. About to give his first pre-game speech, just before a match against St. Kilda, a very nervous Whitten was surprised as a defiant Sutton barged in front of players and staff alike, shook his hand, and gave Ted his best wishes. When asked later what he had said to his players that day, Whitten stated that he couldn't remember. Despite the challenges, Footscray went on to finish 6th on the ladder, missing out on 5th place by a slim percentage. Many have speculated that had Whitten not needed to adjust his playing style to coach that year, he was almost certain to win the Brownlow in 1957. The next few seasons saw most of the 54 Premiership players leave the team for one reason or another, and though they were replaced by young talent, it would take some time to mold them into a winning team. On Saturday, April 30th, 1960, Ted Whitten celebrated his 150-game milestone with a Round 2 victory over North Melbourne. The occasion was capped off by a spectacular mark taken by Whitten at the Arden Street Oval, as well as a watch presented to him after the game, purchased by the Footscray players. It was also around this time that Coach Whitten began introducing a new form of hand pass that had been invented at Fitzroy to his team. Called the flick pass, it was basically a hand pass utilizing the palm of the hand rather than a fist. And with it, Footscray developed a very fast play style which saw them win the 4th spot on the ladder in 1961 and then run through St. Kilda and Melbourne into another grand final, this time against the top of the ladder Hawthorn Hawks. Though the Bulldogs were up by 8 points at halftime, the heat of the day, coupled with Hawthorn being well rested with an extra week off, the young and battered Doggies ran out of steam and lost by a score of 13-16-94 to 7-9-51. Despite the loss, Ted still loved the end of the season trip with his team, like he always did, just like he had as a teenager when he was pinched from Collingwood. It was during such a trip at the end of 1961 to Surfers Paradise in Queensland's Gold Coast that Ted Whitten was given the nickname EJ, perhaps his most famous moniker. Incidentally, the flick pass was permanently ruled illegal in 1966, as it was deemed too fast and difficult for umpires to determine if it was a thrown ball or a legal hand pass. Just how much this contributed to the Bulldogs not making another grand final appearance until 2016 is a discussion perhaps best left for another time. In 1962, the team finished 5th on the ladder, but they did exact some measure of revenge on the Hawks in round 1 by beating them by 33 points. The next few seasons were by and large disappointments, as new talent for the most part failed to adequately fill the large boots of those they replaced. In 1966, the match committee decided a change was in order and brought back Charlie Sutton as coach. Understandably hurt and disappointed, Whitten briefly considered accepting an offer to play at Richmond. However, with his old teammate Jack Collins now elected president, Whitten decided to stay at Footscray and focus on breaking the club record for games played, set by none other than Arthur Oliver, his childhood hero whose Guernsey number he had inherited. On Saturday, June 24, 1967, Whitten did just that when he played his 272nd game for Footscray against Carlton. He ran a lap of honor with legends John Schultz of Footscray and Blues skipper Ron Barassi to the sound of thunderous applause. In 1968, Coach Sutton retired from coaching, and the committee once again turned to EJ in their hour of need. Whitten was thrilled to be coaching again, and in round 1 of the 1969 season, on Monday, April 7th at Princess Park, Whitten celebrated his 300th game with 3 goals in a shootout victory over Fitzroy. In 1970, with the stress of both playing and coaching beginning to take its toll, EJ was told by the Footscray committee that perhaps it was best for him to hang up the boots, despite his wish to continue playing. It was written into his contract that he be allowed to play another 4 games, which would then bring his total to 321, breaking the long-standing record for total VFL games by any player at that time. He was then to retire as a player and stay on as coach. On Saturday, May 2nd, 1970, at the Western Oval, in front of a crowd of almost 20,000 adoring fans, EJ Whitten played his last match of VFL football. It was round 5 against Hawthorn, and Ted Whitten took the field for the last time through an honor guard of Bulldogs and Hawks players. After 3 tough quarters fought in the rain and mud, the Bulldogs were up by a mere 2 points. This was when player and coach Ted Whitten, who had so often sacrificed himself for his team, playing himself in whatever position was needed to fill the roster, asked one last thing from his men in one of the most famous speeches in football history. Unlike his first coach's address before that St. Kilda match 13 years and 210 games ago, no one would forget this one. In part, it went, "Now we have our backs against the wall. We've got to fight and fight hard. It's going to be a do-or-die effort. It's going to be a determined effort. You've got to show me all the guts and determination you have in your body. You've got to inspire me with this last quarter finish. You've been in front all day, and you've got to stay there." The Dogs did indeed hold on to win by 3 points. In fact, only 5 points total were scored in the final term. Later, EJ reportedly said, "I cried, but you couldn't tell because it was raining." A large crowd remained in the wet after the game and watched as Whitten was carried up onto a hastily assembled stage. He thanked them for all their love and support, and they hung on every word EJ spoke as if to somehow delay the conclusion of his nearly 20-year career. But like all good things, it had to end. Whitten stayed on as coach for another season until he was let go. He had already begun to prepare for life after football by building relationships with the many journalists he dealt with on a regular basis, as well as secured deals with advertisers. He became known as an entertaining commentator and host on radio and television. He also put a lot of his effort into promoting the interstate matches known as State of Origin games. During his career, he represented Victoria 29 times, captaining the side twice. This was where he played some of his best footy. Freed from his duties as coach, he was able to focus only on his own game. And, after his playing days were over, no one can forget his congratulatory shouts of, "You stuck it right up them. That's what you did. You stuck it right up them." Unfortunately, Whitten was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1991. Through his media outlets, he spread the message for men not to ignore the warning signs, but his own situation grew worse and worse. He also suffered several strokes, and as a result, his speech was impaired, and he went almost totally blind. In May of 1995, before one of his beloved State of Origin games of Victoria versus South Australia, he was honored at the MCG. He was in tremendous pain and very weak, showing up at the event against medical advice. In the Victorian locker rooms, Danny Spud Frawley, the famous St Kilda defender who had also represented Victoria in previous matches, sat next to Whitten, and as people would come up to pay their respects, Spud would whisper their names in EJ's ear so he could greet them properly. Also, it being a particularly cold May day, Spud also draped his own coat around Whitten to keep him warm. Next, he was driven around the MCG in the back of a white car with his son Ted Jr. sitting beside him and holding on. There was barely a dry eye in the stadium as Whitten waved to the crowd as he made his final lap to the song of Hero by Mariah Carey. It is still considered one of the most emotional moments in all of Australian sports. After that, there was no chance for Victoria to lose the match, and in fact, they won by 63 points. Tony Lockett, affectionately known as Plugger, was awarded the E.J. Whitten Medal, which since 1985 was given out to the best Victorian player in the State of Origin game. And he later stated that to win that medal on that day meant more to him than winning the Brownlow. A few months later, E.J. Whitten died in his home on Thursday, August 17, 1995. He was 62 years old, leaving behind a wife and a son, but all fans of Aussie rules lost something that day as well. His state funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral on Tuesday, August 22nd. The church was packed with mourners, and just as many stood outside. In addition, 2,000 more had packed the Western Oval Social Club to watch the service on television. After the service, the procession passed through an honor guard of former and current Bulldogs, as well as many opponents from years past. It continued on through the streets, lined with crowds on its way out past the Western Oval, where many had laid flowers and other tributes beneath a large painting of their fallen hero. E.J. Whitten was then finally taken to the Altona Memorial Park in Hobson's Bay, Victoria. In his honor, the Western Oval, which already had the E.J. Whitten stand, was renamed the Whitten Oval. It is where the Western Bulldogs practice today. Also, a bridge on the Western Ring Road was named the E.J. Whitten Bridge, and in 1997, a statue was unveiled in front of the Whitten Oval depicting E.J. in full flight after kicking the ball. To actually see it in person is something I will never forget. After his death, Ted Jr. helped establish the E.J. Whitten Legends game. An annual affair, it is a fundraising match of retired players playing between Victoria and the rest of Australia. The funds go to prostate cancer research. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the E.J. Whitten Foundation, which likewise promotes men's health and cancer screening, as well as raising money for medical research. I fear that with listing just these dates and some scores, and telling a few stories, I may have not adequately conveyed just how great a player Ted Whitten was, nor how large a legacy he left behind. So, just how good was E.J. Whitten? Well, in 1996, to celebrate its 100th anniversary, the AFL established a Hall of Fame to recognize those who had made significant and lasting contributions to Australian rules football. The first selection was Ted Whitten. Of that group of 136 inductees, a few of the most remarkable ones were chosen to be elevated as legends of the game. Again, Ted Whitten was the first one selected. That same year, he was also selected to captain the fictitious squad of the best players of the last 100 years, known as the Team of the Century. While he was playing, in 1954, 57, 58, 59, and 1961, he was named as the Bulldogs' best and fairest player, the club's top honor. Also, in 1961, and in 1962, 64, and 1968, he took the club's leading goal kicker award. In all, he kicked 360 goals. Not too shabby for a player-coach who spent much of his time as a defender. And yes, though he never won the Brownlow medal, it should be noted that his habit of vigorously rendering his opinion on umpiring decisions probably didn't do him any favors. The league's top award is, after all, based on votes cast by the officials. Though he was hardly a member of a premiership dynasty, if you ask just about any football historian who was the best all-around Australian football player ever, most will be hard-pressed to come with a better name than Whitten. If you asked any player from the 50s or 60s who they are most proud to have played with, you'll most likely get the same answer. He played the game hard, he played it well, he played it with his own style. He has been called the greatest personality in AFL history, for both his efforts on the field and his philanthropic work off of it. But in the end, Mr. Football somehow just says it all. I will include links to the videos of several moments mentioned in this episode in the show notes. I highly recommend giving them a look. Also, I would be eternally grateful if you would be kind enough to share a link to this podcast with your friends and family, whether they are new to this awesome game of Australian rules football or not. I would also love to hear your comments and suggestions. You can reach me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Stray Dog Footy, and by email at straydogfooty@yahoo.com. Just wanted to quickly mention that I am not endorsed by or officially affiliated with either the Australian Football League or the Western Bulldogs, beyond being a huge fan and supporter. Likewise, I am not endorsed by or affiliated with Peg and the Rejected, but I am a fan of their music. I would like to thank them for the use of their song Red, White, Black and Blue, which I used a portion of as the intro to this episode, and I will play us out to it in its entirety. I like the song so much, not just for the great feeling it gives, but also, to me at least, it invokes images of a hard-fought, bloody, muddy, and wonderful Bulldogs footy match. I will, of course, leave a link in the show notes to their music. Oh yeah, before I go, thanks to Toby McLean of the Western Bulldogs for taking and answering my question in this week's edition of the People's Presser. I wish I had thought of something more clever to ask, but still it was a lot of fun. And Toby, if by some slim chance you're actually listening to this, just so you know, you are one of the few people that has ever nailed the English pronunciation of my real name on the first try. Good on you, mate. Cheers, everyone.